Ach, up, ach, up, ach. Oh, wang, 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 wang.
Good morning. My name is Chris Fox, and today we're talking about currency in fictional worlds. How do we present this as authors to our readers in a way that's not boring, but is also internally consistent? So, this is most useful for authors who write science fiction or fantasy. You may find that if you write, more modern settings, it's just easy to model real-world currency and just be like, hey, they're in this country. We're going to use whatever the currency in that country is. But this video is going to be for people who have to make up their own. So either you're in a fictional ancient world culture, or you've made up your own world. Whatever the case is, you need to make money and decide how your culture functions. Now, there are four different types of systems that I group this into. So the first, and this is the most primitive, is barter. They may not have developed some sort of direct trade. So perhaps we have two tribes, and they live across a valley from each other. And on one side of this, they are mining frost sapphires from the mountains. So these things have been scattered there somehow, and they found a way to mine them, and they're highly prized by the second tribe. And the second tribe on the other valley has some sort of warm spring where they can grow food, and so they have an abundance of food. So you're going to get some barter where tribe number two is going to trade the bounty, the food, to tribe number one, who lives in a slightly colder climate, who can give them hard, durable goods. For tribe number one that mines the frost sapphires, they have no practical value. Maybe they're magical. Maybe they make things cold. But if you look at the other tribe, maybe they can use that for air conditioning because their houses are warmer because of, they're near a fire catalyst, which is how they're getting this warm water and all this abundance of food. You get to decide sort of how the cultures work and how they interact with each other. But at the lowest level, I guess, barter comes into existence. Now, past barter, you may eventually find that societies agree on a type of currency. One of the advantages of a kingdom or a nation is that it can usually institute a single type of currency, so you don't have a whole bunch of little city-states and towns that are using their own types of coins that they mint. Certain types of precious metals are usually valued, so in our real world it was gold, and we'll talk about the gold standard in a minute, which is something that's used in the real world. But getting back to hard currency, when it is first implemented, when you get past the barter system, when people are now starting to codify money, they typically choose something to use as money that is in itself inherently valuable. So gold is the great example, and it was most frequently used in our own world. A talent of gold is mentioned in the Bible, for example. And there were different shapes and types used in coins in different societies. But ancient Egypt got to be as powerful as it did in the New Kingdom because it controlled the flow of gold coming out of Africa. Gold has been traditionally super, super important because it makes for a great currency. A very small amount of it is very valuable, and so you can make these coins and you can exchange goods at a much higher rate. So what you're doing in your societies is you're agreeing this is about how much a gold is worth. If you want to buy a horse, it's going to cost you 10 gold coins, and so that's generally agreed upon. And people are using this to trade for important things. So usually you still see some barter in societies for smaller stuff where it's like maybe a gold coin is too much money, and so you're going to have to trade some services for some food from a farm or something. There's going to be a little bit of low-level bartering still happening in most societies that have hard currency. When you invest when you advance past that and start getting into currency systems that are more similar to the real world, now we're talking about something called the gold standard. And this is something that we used for a very, very long time. It was repealed in, I want to say, the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong on the date. But up until that point, the United States, you heard about Fort Knox, and we had this tremendous supply of gold. And so our currency was backed by gold. So we knew there was always a certain amount of gold behind it, and so people would trust the strength of our currency because they knew that there was this hard, durable good. And so when you exchange money at that point, we're using what's called the fiat currency. You don't have a currency that's worth anything. So you notice that we're using paper. And in our society, paper has no inherent value. If you look at the money, a $20 bill, that bill itself does not have any value to you. Even if you were to burn it, it'd be gone in seconds. Like there's nothing this paper could do for you that's really valuable. But what it represents that's fiat currency. It's representative currency. So in your world, you may have that. And it doesn't have to be paper. It could be chips. It could be gems. It could be all sorts of different things. You get to decide what fits in your world and what people decide they want to trade with and what's going to represent that currency. It could be clay tablets that are broken into pieces, and different size pieces are worth different amounts. And you really can take it a lot of different ways, and we can model that from the real world. But the point behind fiat currency is if I want to buy a house, I can't carry, 1,800 pounds of gold, or that's just not feasible, or I might get robbed. So if I can give you a bag full of something that we both agree is valuable, paper money in this case, the gold never needs to leave anywhere. It's still sitting at Fort Knox. It's just the ownership of that gold is changing from me to you. And so that fiat representative currency allows societies to grow much larger. So when you're writing your societies, your ancient societies, if you want them to be more advanced and more like the Renaissance, you're probably going to want banks and some sort of representative currency. And that brings us to fractional reserve lending, which this part will probably horrify you about the real world. I mean, it does. Every time I've given this speech, I used to give this speech at Toastmasters, and I'd go around to various places. It's called bank is a 4-letter word. Well, fractional reserve lending works in the real world like this. This is really how money is created in our world. So let's take your local bank, let's say Bank of America, and you decide that you want to buy a house. You find a house that you're going to buy. And you go into Bank of America and you say, I need you to loan me $500,000. Now, logically, you would assume that Bank of America has a vault with a bunch of money in it, and they're going to give you $500,000. That's not actually how it works. They invent $500,000 out of nothing, out of thin air. They just, type it into a system and say, okay, now that money exists. And they can only create so much money. So they have to have a reserve. This is where fractional reserve lending comes from. And so let's say that reserve is $10 million. They can loan that money out up to like 10 more times. So if you've got $10 million sitting in a bank account, the money never leaves the account. So Bank of America always keeps that base $10 million. But they can create free money out of thin air that you are responsible for them paying back, to pay back to them. Whenever they do a loan. So if you buy a car, they invent that currency out of nothing. If you buy a house, they invent that currency out of nothing. Most of the strength of the American economy and most economies in the world is based off of this idea that human debt is the value behind currency now. And it's crazy to me that we've come to this in the world. But if you're going to be writing any sort of futuristic setting, this is what you want to start working with, because now we're not talking about gold or hard goods for currency anymore. Now we're talking about credits, digital goods where there's no real value behind it and it's just concepts. It's usually just debt. The idea that you're transferring other people's debt. That's the value of, in the case of America, the American dollar is based literally on the American economy, the strength of our economy. That's how we convince people that the dollar has value. So you're going to do the same thing in your fictional universe. And what's interesting is you can write this. If there's a crisis of faith in that nation, if they lose prestige or power, there can be a run on their banks, which will dramatically weaken the strength of their currency. So that's a huge weakness. You can have a lot of credit expand out of a currency that's based on something intangible, like the value of people, because you just make it up. You just type in some zeros in a system and you say, okay, I just say that this money exists. And in the case of our real world, if you think about something like a mortgage loan for a $500,000 house, really what you're doing is signing a piece of paper called the deed, and that deed is the $500,000. It represents the money that you have created. That's why banks have to be so careful with the note and the deed. Those documents are the legal tender itself, effectively. You've created this loan, and you agreeing to pay it back is the value of that loan. So it used to be Fort Knox, it used to be we own some gold or maybe real estate or something would back that loan, and now nothing backs that loan except for debt. And so if you're going to be writing in the modern day or you're creating your own civilization, these are things you can play with. You can use any type of currency in any way. So if you remember the old song about the company store where, one day older and deeper in debt, you can have currencies that are set up to exploit their population and can ask some really interesting questions, especially in dystopian future. So when you are presenting currency in your society, you want to think about what resources they're going to be using, what stage they're at in terms of development. Are they going to be using barter? Do they have some sort of hard currency like gold that is valuable to them? Have they advanced to the point where now the gold resides in banks and they're just trading notes back and forth with something like fractional reserve lending? You sort of need to decide how advanced your culture is and then build around that. If you're doing fantasy, hard currencies usually work best because in a world where there are multiple nations, hard currencies are the simplest way for you to trade value and move it around. You need in a digital culture where people are putting ones and zeros in computer systems, everybody to agree that that system is the system that they use. And without that agreement, it doesn't work. Whereas with hard goods, you don't need people to agree. Your gold has value, and someone somewhere is going to want that. Whereas, your digital dollars in a system, if tomorrow we decide that the dollar isn't worth anything, wouldn't be worth anything. You couldn't trade the digital money, the ones and zeros in a system, for anything. So anyway, hopefully this is useful. Currency is a topic that I know a great deal about. I spent many, many years in finance working at credit unions, and I used to sell pools of mortgage loans directly on Wall Street. I worked in the mortgage industry. So if you have questions about currency or how to present it to your fictional world, please feel free to ask those in the comments, and I'm happy to answer those. If you have your own insights that I didn't cover in the video, I invite you to include those below. A fair number of people read the comments, so if you know a lot about this aspect of world building, sound off about it in the comments. Share your wisdom. I'd love to hear that stuff. Anyway, guys, I do need to get back to the writing. I am knee-deep in, what am I writing today? Dryker's Stand. After I finish that, I'll be working on Eradicator a little bit. So Dryker's Stand is book 2 in Void Wraith Origins. Will be out in a few weeks. And the final book that I'm working on for this year is Eradicator, which is book 5 in Magitech Legacy. Anyway, like I said, going to get back to the writing, and I'll see you guys next week.